Welcome everyone to the second session of today's Laredo and Webb County Metropolitan Planning Organization training. This is the first of, I would hope, multiple trainings that we'll do at least once a year, but more often more, I hope. We'll always do at least one general one a year, but in the future, we're going to provide additional trainings like the sessions this afternoon that go into specific areas of interest. If you weren't at the first meeting, we are recording this meeting, and because of that, I'm going to actively try to keep everyone's mic muted. Unless, of course, you have something you want to say that's important, feel free to unmute yourself, but please mute yourself after. It just helps preserve the audio quality for the recording because we're going to release this to everybody, the general public, afterwards to view. Bill, in the last meeting, you asked that we generally hold questions till the end unless somebody had an important question or comment. Would you like to keep it that way, or do you want it to be more open this time?
We can go ahead and have it be a little bit more open this time. Sure.
Okay, it's a smaller crowd. That makes sense. So he might pause more, or others can jump in if they have comments. We'll let Bill kind of take the lead on that. Today's or this afternoon's first session. This is on planning and programming. We're going to go over the 3C planning process and how to implement it. We'll talk about why it's so important to plan as an MPO for transportation planning. And we're going to talk about project selection, the process, and how the process should work when it's done well. This is going to be a 1-hour session, and then there'll be about a 15-minute break, and then we'll get into the next session, which is at 2:15 to 3:15. Then there'll be another 15-minute break, and the last session today will be at 3:30 to 4:30. If you cannot make part or any of the meetings today, don't worry. Again, it's going to be recorded and it'll be released widely to everybody that was on the list before, and then generally to the public as well, and posted on our website. So thank you everybody for taking the time to join us, and thank you to TTI. As I mentioned in the first session, Bill and the TTI team, the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, work for all of the MPOs in, well, it's one of the things they do. They do other great things as well, but they provide services to all the MPOs in the state of Texas to act as our advisors, to help us on projects, and to provide trainings for us and for elected officials. So thank you very much, Bill, for making time in your schedule, and the TTI team for helping set this up and schedule it. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Bill.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I'm not going to go through a big introduction like I did this morning, but I am Bill Frawley with Texas A&M Transportation Institute, and glad to be able to help out with this module this afternoon. And I do want to go ahead and pass on the accolades to TxDOT, Transportation Planning and Programming Division. That's their contract that we have with them that funds our work with the MPOs, including training workshops like this and other assistance that we provide. So again, Texas MPOs are very blessed and fortunate to have the TxDOT sponsorship and dedication to the funding of our assistance. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into it. Carol, are you advancing slides this time?
Yes, she is.
Okay. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And actually go one more. I put two out of order by accident. If you go one more slide, then we're going to back up. All right. So just some expectations out of this module. When we're finished, I'd like everyone to be able to understand and explain what we call the 3C process. I'd like you to be able to tell people why transportation planning is important and answer what I call the so what question. Be able to explain visions, goals, objectives, performance measures, and targets, and then explain some performance-based planning basics, if you will. So, Carol, we go ahead and go backwards to the previous slide. I apologize for this. As I mentioned this morning, but I know some people may be present now that weren't here this morning, the 3C planning process is what the Federal Highway Administration likes to have basically the MPO process built upon. And those 3 C's, as you can see, are comprehensive, continuing, and cooperative. So, Carol, if you'll advance 2 slides now, please. There we go. So here's a little bit of detail, and I'm going to go into more on each one of these because this is so important. Comprehensive means all modes are included, and it covers the entire metropolitan area. Continuing means we have repeating planning cycles, typically on a 5-year planning basis, because that's what the MTP cycle is, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And it also means we're continually assessing progress and impacts as we go through and then enter the next planning cycle. And then cooperative means that all member agencies participate and work together. Next one, please. So a little bit more on comprehensive. How do we get there? What do we do? Well, it means be inclusive of all modes and related issues. So that means automobile, truck, bicycle, pedestrian, transit, air, and anything else that comes along. It can go all the way to rail, pipeline. I mean, the list can go on and on. And so, but what it means is we have to make sure that all of these modes kind of interrelate as appropriate and that the proper attention is given to each one. And as I mentioned this morning, Laredo, especially given its population, has really more emphasis on transit and bicycle pedestrian than a lot of MPOs of your size. So you really have the opportunity and actually do a good job at being comprehensive all the way around. Another way to do this, to implement this, is to reach out proactively to the operators of all modes, trucking companies, the transit agency, the airport, and then the people who use the bicycle and pedestrian facilities, so bicycle advocacy groups and so on. And that goes right into reaching out proactively to the users of all modes of the system, including transit riders and everyone else. Next slide, please. So continuing, well, it's really a never-ending process is what planning is. I mean, before one plan expires, you start to begin working on the next one because to do an MTP can take anywhere from a year and a half or even a little bit longer. And so we're always in that process of making sure our planning processes are up to date and that we have the right types of projects and strategies selected using all the techniques that we should. It also means we're accommodating changing circumstances. Different cities, different areas will grow at different rates at different times based on economic development, socioeconomic data, national trends, regional trends, and so on. So again, our continuing process means we're accommodating and allowing for different circumstances that change. Next. And then cooperative, again, inclusive of all MPO member agencies, ensure that everyone has a seat at the appropriate tables, meaning the Transportation Policy Board or the Technical Advisory Committee, or being able to participate through workshops and stakeholder groups. And then really every agency has some of its own plans. So the city will have a comprehensive plan. The county might have a thoroughfare plan or other types of things. There's capital improvement plans and programs, bicycle plans. We have to make sure that we're looking at all these plans together so that they're in harmony and one of them's not really contradicting another one. And then it also means proactively reach out to advocacy groups, especially things like any type of ADA groups. Sometimes there's special groups in certain areas that deal with visually impaired or other types of ADA situations, those having to rely on wheelchairs and other mobility assistance, special interests like bicycle advocacy groups and so on. Sometimes it even means reaching out to things like PTA groups to get the school parents involved, because if they're having to drop off or pick up, or their children are having difficult times walking or biking to school and so on. And then proactively reaching out to stakeholders, including private industry. That could be railroads, trucking companies, developers, anyone that has either a major impact on or is a major user or both of the transportation system. So this 3C process is really, really very important and can be done, relatively easily. Next. So I have a question to see if we have any comments that anyone wants to jump in with. Why should we plan? Does anyone have a thought on why we do transportation planning? And at the same time, kind of answer that question. Someone might come along and go, oh, you have a 25-year plan. So what?
Maybe I can lead off while others
Sure.
are thinking about it. And again, if you have a comment, feel free to unmute and then just mute yourself after. But Bill, I would say as a planner, as a city planner, you learn about land use and you learn about policies and plans that can be created. But I think it isn't until you get some experience as a planner till you realize that the most important planning, maybe 80% of it, is where we our transportation planning, where we put our routes, most importantly, where we put our vehicle routes, just the way this country is. with the amount of vehicles we use. So transportation and planning isn't just important for how we get around. It is important for how for all aspects of planning, for how we use our land, for quality of life. There's so much that's impacted by planning, and I just pulled that out of my head. But I would say 80% of all the planning we do, all the how a city is developed, those decisions are made because we make the transportation decisions.
Well, Kirby, you hit the nail on the head with a big part of it is that interrelationship between transportation and land use. And we have to make sure that our projects are either accommodating what's going on with land use, as well as it goes back to that cooperative part of the 3C process. Do the land use planners have a seat at the table, and are they understanding the importance of what's going on with transportation planning and how land use decisions can affect future roads and potential projects? Very good.
Hey, Bill, this is Kurt.
Yeah,
I was just checking to see if my mute button was working.
your
But,
unmute button works.
mute button works. I just want to make sure that we understand one of the visions of ICE-T and T21 and after later the FAST Act was making sure we have safe, effective, efficient movement of people and goods. And I think that's the overall arching goal of all the planning processes that we have statewide and metropolitan is make sure we have that connection with movement of passenger and freight movements, making sure that they're safe and effective and efficient.
Very good point, Kirk. Thank you. Okay, well, I don't see or hear anyone else jumping in. Very happy for anyone too. And if you have something that comes up along the way, please do. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So the transportation planning process, we had this slide earlier, but it was worth repeating here as we go more into this. If you provide sound information and you consider all the potential impacts, both coming into planning or as a result of the impacts from transportation planning, and you follow the process of engaging the public, engaging stakeholders, and consider a lot of the things we're going to talk about here in just a little while, vision, goals, objectives, and so on, you are going to set up the decision makers, in this case, the Transportation Policy Board, to make the best decisions possible. You know, there can always be debate about was it the right decision, but if they can base their decisions on these are the best solutions we could come up with the funding available and our given situation at this time, then everyone should be pretty well satisfied overall. Next one, please. So why should we plan and so what? Well, we need to have a purpose when we're building projects, buying capital equipment, or implementing strategies or any of the other things that result. And without a purpose, we can just be going off in a whole variety of different ways. And this blends in a lot with what Kirk was saying. If we have a purpose, a vision of the safe and efficient movement of people and goods, basically, then our projects need to align with that. And, you know, you can think a lot of this too in terms of your own personal lives. If you have a purpose overall for what you're doing, then your actions hopefully will match up with that, and the use of your valuable time or your own money will line up with that. Next one, please. So getting into some performance-based planning and getting into these terms I've been using, goals, objectives, and so on, this all blends together, and this really all ties into the project selection process as well. So this is all kind of a comprehensive discussion. So for those that aren't aware, in the last couple of, actually about 4 or 5 years, there was a push with the federal legislation and the rules to have performance-based planning. And what that means is we want to select the best projects, capital goods, strategies, whatever it is, that help us achieve different types of targets that are based on performance measures that help us attain goals and objectives. So I just worked up the ladder there. But if you go back to, if we have a vision, and sometimes there's been vision statements created or visioning workshops, but it can be based on something, again, like Kirk mentioned, the safe and efficient movement of people and goods. That's a very common type vision statement. Then you're going to develop goals and objectives that help meet that, performance measures and targets, and then monitoring and so on. Let's go to the next slide, please. So to get this into a little bit more of a hierarchy, that vision is that very broad statement of how the future transportation should serve the users. The goals are achievements that help fulfill the vision. So a goal might be, for example, let's reduce the number of fatalities on our major highways in Laredo. That is something somewhat specific, but it's not too specific yet. So to get more specific, then we would have some objectives. Let's decrease the number of fatalities by 10% over the next 10 years or something like that. That's a measurable step towards achieving the goal. And then we can have some performance measures that help us, chart our progress. And just like kids in school get grades and so on. And so we might say, okay, well, to look at the reducing the fatalities, what are we going to measure? Measure fatal crashes. We'll measure fatalities. We'll measure fatal crash rates and so on. There's a few things that we can do depending on how we're trying to look at it. And then targets are specific measurements that you want to achieve by a certain time. So we might say, we want to improve 7 hazardous intersections or hotspot intersections by the year 2025, or we want to try to reduce fatal crashes in Laredo by 10% by a certain year. We're getting very specific by a certain time. One thing that I believe is always important for people to understand when you're working with performance-based planning, goals and objectives and performance measures, and including the targets, sometimes you're going to hit those achievements and sometimes you're not. Don't get too hung up and don't feel like the whole process has gone bad if you don't hit your targets. There's always a chance through monitoring, which is one of the key parts of this, having a feedback loop to figure out, did we do what we were hoping for? Did we get those results or did we not? If we did, that's great. Let's repeat and go on forward. If we didn't, let's figure out what we can do differently. Next slide, please. When you're setting these targets so that you can set yourself up for success while still sometimes being challenging, make sure your targets are reasonable. Again, are we trying to reduce all fatalities in 5 years? That's awesome if we could do it. Unfortunately, it's just not reasonable to get to that 0 by that short amount of time. Are they appropriate for your area? Are they things that are important with your vision, with your goals and objectives? Are they measurable? Can we, if we're going to say we want to do something, can we actually measure? Can we afford to go out and collect that data? Are the data available? And so on. And then are the targets aligned with national, state, and metropolitan visions, goals, and objectives? Next one, please. So why do we do performance-based planning? Well, number one, it is a federal requirement, but that's not the only reason. We're not just there to check off the box. It provides for accountability and transparency. Again, like I was alluding to earlier, if we set the decision makers up to make the best decisions possible, and we are trying to benefit the public as much as possible using taxpayer dollars, then we can tie our projects back to meeting goals and objectives, achieving targets when we're trying to improve safety, mobility, bridge construction, or bridge condition, and so on. And then it provides this feedback loop that I mentioned earlier. Did we get the expected results that we wanted? Did we reduce fatalities or crashes? Or sometimes did we have a little bit of an opposite effect or not as big of an impact as we wanted? If so, can or should we do something different in the future? Do we need to be aware of something else? Next one, please. So performance goals under MAP 21, which was moving ahead for progress in the 21st century. That was federal legislation that brought about performance-based planning. There were goals in these 7 different categories: safety, infrastructure condition, which is pavement and bridges, basically, congestion reduction, so mobility, system reliability. Can I count on getting somewhere in a reasonable amount of time or consistently? Freight movement, economic vitality, environmental sustainability, and then reduced project delivery delays. Go ahead for the next one, please. There's also ones, and we've been focusing a lot on the highway side, but on the transit side, there's some performance-based planning issues also. Something that's called state of good repair for the equipment. You know, are we able to keep our buses running for as many years or as miles as was intended or hoped for? Are we doing the maintenance? Do we have some other issues that we're not taking care of? So are our mobile and revenue-based assets, revenue-generating assets, and the other ones maintained in a state of good repair? If we monitor this along the way, hopefully we won't be surprised at how quickly or when we need to start replacing or doing major repairs, such as engine overhauls or transmission overhauls on buses and stuff. And then public transportation safety. We want to make sure that we're providing the safest situation for riders in terms of crashes, as well as safety while on board or at bus stops and those types of things as well. Next one, please. So the performance measures that were brought about at the federal level for for the different things, you can see pavement condition. This is looked at for performance-based planning that's required on the interstate highway system and then the other elements of the national highway system. And then bridge condition on the national highway system. Performance of the interstate system and the remainder of the NHS. Are we having a reliable amount of time that we can usually plan to get from point A to point B? Fatalities, and we need to go in and change this when it says serious injuries. They've actually changed that to suspected serious injuries. But basically looking at the number as well as the rate of crashes on public roads. And this is all public roads. And what we talk about is the difference between the number and the rate. It's very important to think about if we're looking at safety hotspots, we could have a location, an intersection or corridor, say, where there's a high number of fatal crashes. We also need to look at the volume on the road because we could have another location where there's an equal number of crashes over the same period of time, but the amount of traffic is a lot less, which means you're really going to have more crashes per million vehicle miles traveled. Or in other words, you'll have a higher risk of being in a crash there. The other thing too is when you look at fatalities, it's important to look at the number of fatal incidents as much as the number of fatalities. And this is something I stress with MPOs all around the state when looking at safety. The number of fatal incidents really gives an indication of, do we have a hot spot where there's a safety issue? Because you could have one crash that might, and it sounds morbid, but might kill 4 or 5 people, where that same crash, just because you have different vehicles or different numbers of people in there, might only have 1 or 2 fatalities. So the incidents can sometimes be a lot more indicating of where you need to find some solutions. And you can see the rest of the performance measures. They line up with what we've been talking about. Next one, please. So monitoring in our performance-based planning, this is where we get to that feedback loop a lot. Are we getting what we expected out of it? It also goes with monitoring the performance of the projects. Are we keeping the projects on track? If we said that we were selecting some projects because they had a safety element to them, are we following through with that? And then when we open the projects up to the motoring public, it's important to look at, did we get what we expected out of it? Number one, we need to know so that we can determine, are we doing the right types of projects in the right way? But also it helps to have that accountability and transparency back to the public so that they understand, as an agency, we're not just going out there selecting some random pet projects, if that makes sense. Okay, next one, please. So how does performance-based planning tie into one of these documents we talked about earlier, the big one for the MPOs, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan? So the MTP, according to the federal guidelines, needs to include a description of the performance measures and targets that were used in assessing the system, and then talk about how will the projects that are in there help achieve the targets. And then once you've had a number of years and you have some projects that have had some impact, looking back and go, okay, and in the past, here's how we've succeeded, or here's the impact that some projects have had. But a lot of it is, how do the projects that we've selected in the upcoming years, how do they help us achieve what we want to accomplish related to performance targets? Again, accountability and transparency to show that there's a purpose for what we're doing with our projects. Next, please. So also with the Transportation Improvement Program and the statewide TIP, they have to link in priorities. So again, there needs to be a statement about how the project selection process, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit, help match up the projects to the targets that we're trying to achieve. And so one of the basic things when we're talking about project selection is you need to go through a process where you can score the projects objectively as much as possible, while understanding there are some subjective aspects to project selection as well. And as I've taught some courses on performance-based planning around the country at different times, we've gained different experiences from places all around. Some people have it to where 75% of their scoring for projects is based on objective data, number of crashes, travel time delay for congestion, while some maybe 25% for that same group may be more subjective of in terms of, well, we don't have empirical data, but we know from people telling us their stories or at workshops, the public has said this is what's needed. And so we know there will be some public support. And there can be a range from 50-50 to 60-40, all the way to 75-25. There's no rule that says how much that has to be, but it's very important to have some objective elements, and probably more than half of your scoring process should be that way. Next slide, please. A couple of other issues that come up are resiliency and vulnerability. It's really tied together. Part of this whole thing is, what is resiliency? Well, it's basically the ability for the transportation system to plan for and then also recover from some type of a disruption, whether that's a natural disaster, a man-made disaster, but anything that can disrupt the transportation system or a part of it for a period of hours to days or weeks. Unfortunately, you're not along the coast, so you're not likely to have a hurricane disruption, which I saw in Beaumont, where I-10 was underwater for a couple of weeks, and they were having to reroute traffic hundreds of miles out of the way for Interstate 10. They'd have to have them go all the way up north to I-20. But you can have some things that are related to tornadoes. You can have some things that are related to other types of disruptions, whether it's roads blocked by a major crash or incident for hours. How do other roads in the system accommodate that traffic, and how do you get the word out to the public about some detours? It can also have to do with some other types of events, if pavement buckles because of a drought, or if there was a sinkhole or something like that. How quickly can you get traffic rerouted, let people know, but then how can you recover, but basically keep the whole transportation system going so you're not just in a kind of a lockdown situation. Next one, please. So this is a time I'd just like to open it up for some discussion again and say, what have been some successes in either selecting projects or getting projects to be successful or addressing major issues in the Laredo area, as well as if someone has an idea based on experience, what are some things that might be improved? And this is the interactive part.
Bill, I'm gonna solicit again anybody's thoughts on this. Maybe somebody who's been here for the whole HR Ruthinger process, to see how we have got the private sector, city and county, TxDOT working together. Does anybody want to speak about that project, the planning that went into it?
And I'll toss out something else that might be in there, because I'd like to have some pretty good discussion, if we could, about project selection, because there's some things I can say. And this is the last actual kind of title slide for this module, and I was trying to allow for some more discussion. But when it comes into project selection, and I've already kind of gone through a little bit of the discussion about it, needs to be objective as much as possible, but it needs to go out to the public. And so I think one thing that's kind of interesting, fun, but important to talk about is, what are different people's kind of attitudes toward public engagement? Why do we do it? How much should we do? And what do we expect out of it? I'll toss out there while we're waiting to see if anyone wants to chime in. Sometimes I've found that some agencies will go through public involvement as part of their their project selection process, almost as we'll check the box. We know what we want to do, and so we'll go out and show them after we've selected what we want and say, isn't this great? Wouldn't y'all love how these projects are going to make things better? But and I know Kirk's going to go in more into some public involvement later on. But as part of a project selection process, we need to be open at the beginning to what the public has to say to us, because ultimately the users, whether it's transit riders, people walking, bicycling, driving automobiles, driving large trucks, they're the people that we are building these projects for. They're the users of the system, our customers. So, like just to get some input, if anyone has some thoughts on getting some of that involvement, and how would you respond to some different ideas that people might have for some projects, whether it's, wow, that's kind of way out there, or it makes sense.
I'll add something from the tech side perspective, and something
Thanks.
I think is really important. When we do these public involvements, what we're really trying to shift towards is providing a deliverable that is easily understandable to the public. And when I mean that, I mean, the use of technology, 3D models, and all these elements that are really helping the public understand, okay, what is it that we're really trying to do, and engage them to get their comments and get their suggestions. And to go with what you're talking about, I think we need to be open to all the comments that they have, and we always are. And to the point of, a lot of times we get involved in these projects and we are so familiar with them that we get kind of tunnel vision. We're only seeing one way, but someone from the outside may have a different perspective and may be able to add a different element to the project that we may not have been thinking about. So it's always important to look at that. But I go back to, first, how can we engage the public to get those comments first, right? Because that, I think, is the most important thing, actually getting them to the table and having them provide comments.
Tito, that's a really good thing that you brought up, and I appreciate you sharing it. And so I'm just going to ask, to get some discussion going, ask a question. Have you ever had examples of when something that someone from the public offered up actually changed either the project selection, the ranking, or elements of a specific project?
And kind of just to add to that, and to add
Yeah.
to what Tito was saying, I think that goes into several of the meetings that the MPO has hosted over the years. I know COVID has changed a lot of the interaction that we've had with the public, but in previous years we would have, evening, open house at the public library where people would be able to come in anytime after working hours when they're off of work, and come in and look at the planning that the MPO is doing, look at all the projects that have been selected. And also it was kind of interactive, because we would have maps where it's like, oh, you walk in, you have a post-it, and it's like you could, the circle post-its, and you could put the circle to where you worked as to where you live, so kind of have that interaction of people coming in, but also looking at the projects that were being proposed on our short-term and long-range plans, so that people as they're coming in, becoming more educated with what we were doing, also saying, well, this seems like a more important project, and that has direct input into the ranking for what we have done as an MPO, at least from the technical committee side. I know that's something that we've done in the past, and I thought it was very engaging. And it gave us an opportunity to discuss, not only amongst ourselves, but amongst the members of the public. How we do that moving forward in the era of COVID is a good question. I think probably what we're going to be looking at, maybe, and what we're seeing in the trend, is moving towards more social media or online platforms, where maybe we have interactive maps where people can pin those locations, kind of like how you would do on an iPhone, where you could drop a pin. Maybe that's something to look into moving forward, so we could still have that interaction and that feedback from the community without adhering to social distancing and not being able to congregate all together.
Those are very good points. Thank you for sharing that perspective, and how the COVID era has kind of changed or modified some of the public involvement too.
To speak to that, I think definitely COVID has changed how we do things right now. I hope it changes how we do things forever. One of the interesting things that we've seen in all of our meetings, but the one that highlights it the most is one of our city council meetings. One of the first ones they did, and we don't do this anymore, but the first one we did was broadcast on Facebook Live. And now we've moved away from that for whatever reasons we have our own way of broadcasting it, a Spectrum channel and a public WebEx but we used Facebook Live the first time we did it, and we had over like 2,000 people. Of course, it was a
Wow.
really big meeting because everybody was worried about COVID and what we're doing. So I'm not saying we'd get 2,000 every time, but
Sure.
one of the reasons we got thousands of people participating in that first meeting was because here in Laredo, people really like Facebook. They're really familiar with it, and no public meeting have we ever had that many people before participating in some way. And while we always want to have a face-to-face element, I think that's the most ideal. It feels the most genuine. It's enjoyable for us as well to meet face-to-face with folks. If we can move things online to reach more people, then we should be doing that because we'll get more. If we make it, my philosophy is the easier we can make it for the public to participate, if that means using Facebook or whatever tool is out there, then we should be doing it.
Good.
And to add to that, what Kirby just mentioned, that first Facebook meeting, what I think was most powerful from it was the immediate interaction with the public as things were being discussed, because it was being broadcast on Facebook, but you had council members checking their own Facebook messages and streams because people were responding as things were getting discussed. And you would see the council members, oh, I just got this message from so and so, and they're saying this, and now I'm hearing from my constituents in relation to this and how it's going to affect them. And it was that immediate on-demand interaction with your local government that made you inclusive in the decision-making process. I think it was a bit chaotic, but at the same time, and kind of disruptive at times, because people would stop and say, no, hold on, I'm getting my constituent feedback on the spot, which is excellent and great. But if that could be transformed in a way that is productive and adds to the citizen participation to take ownership in the process, I thought that was a remarkable thing that I had never seen before, to be quite honest.
Juan, do you think that did anything to impact the project selection or ranking ultimately?
I don't know, because I know like one of the last meetings I recall that we held at the public library, the technical committee had already come up with a listing of projects of what we wanted funded. And it was more along the lines of, okay, which one should get funded first? And that had that feedback from the community. And I think the general consensus of what the technical committee wanted and what the public wanted was the clover in the intersection of 20 and 35 on the north side of Laredo. And that, I don't think it necessarily changed the ranking. I think it was more of an affirmation of, okay, we are on par with citizen expectations and citizen demands. So it was more of an affirmation point as opposed to, oh, well, we thought this was the important project, but the community thinks this is a different priority.
So a positive impact of affirmation, then that's good.
Correct.
And that probably shows a success in how projects were scored by staff and or technical advisory committee, whoever had the opportunity, and say, these are the projects that are going to meet the goals of our area. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, that would be a fair assessment.
Okay. So I'd like to ask another question if anyone wants to chime in. If someone can think of a project in Laredo, whether recent or some time back or one that's going to come up in the future, and how it's going to address a certain need, and let's say especially if it's a congestion mobility need or a safety need, and let's talk a little bit about how that project was selected and how it came about.
I want to say kind of a big project. I don't have too much information about the project, but I think a big project that is coming is the Loop 20.
Okay.
coming to I-69. So it's right now, if I'm not mistaken, Loop 20 is 3 lanes in some locations and 2 lanes in another. So it's gonna become a highway with frontage roads. So it's gonna have a huge mobility improvement.
Okay. And so someone, whether it's Jose, you, or someone else that knows kind of the process a little bit, when that project was first discussed and then it became something that was, okay, let's, consider it along with other projects, what type of considerations were given as it became prioritized or scored?
Bill, I don't have too much information about that because I'm fairly new in the section. So this project was, I want to say, a while ago, several years ago, when it started like getting in the inside right on the UTP and the steep. So I don't have that information to share.
That's okay. Someone else participating might, or if no one does, let's even look at it from the aspect of, let's say if that was a new project now, what types of things should be considered and scored on that?
I want to say probably traffic congestions, safety, mobility.
Yes. And so what I'm kind of hoping to kind of lead y'all walking through is, and what you're getting to is the types of things that need to be considered whenever you're going to select a project. So if you have a roadway that has 3 lanes each direction part of the time, 2 lanes each direction part of the time, sometimes there's grade separations, sometimes it's at grade intersections, much like Loop 20 is around the east side of Laredo as it goes through different sections. Then there's some different issues that come up. It can be safety in terms of the driver expectation. I'm going from one cross section to another. I'm used to going at a higher speed with overpasses. Now I'm coming into a stretch where there's at grade intersections and traffic signals. It was 3 lanes wide each direction. Now it's only 2 lanes wide. So there's a bottleneck where we have to merge into 2 lanes, or a lane becomes right turn only or doesn't continue. And that can affect travel time and things like that in terms of how well can I rely on that roadway to get me from point A to point B in a certain range of time. So I just kind of ran through a bunch of things there. But what I'm trying to pull out of people is, what is important whenever you are looking at the roadways? I think we've all kind of agreed that safety, crashes, fatalities, and so on. But when we look at mobility and congestion, those are kind of easy or good base words to use. And everyone that's mentioned these things is on the right track. But when we dig down a little bit further, what does it mean to us, and especially to the users of the system, when we're trying to improve the congestion or mobility?
Bill, just to check in here, you've got 15 minutes.
Okay.
And for these sessions, we need to be a little tight because of
Yeah.
the break between the two.
No problem. And this is kind of the wrap up part of all this. So thank you for making sure. We may actually finish a few minutes early, but just trying to pull in some discussion about, as we conclude here, what's important to each of us that's on this call today, as well as to the users when we talk about, okay, I want better mobility, I want less congestion. How do we measure that?
Yeah.
Probably by the level of service, the access management, how many access per mile does that highway have?
Very good. You've hit on some great things. So you've got level of service, which is starting to be, or kind of in the process of being replaced by like travel time index, but level of service A through F. And then we've got those measurements. I'm glad you brought up the access management and the access points per mile, because as we look at how many driveways and street intersections on a corridor there are, that can start to indicate that's how many times people as a driver need to be prepared to slow down or speed back up. And those are the types of things that we can say, okay, that corridor, because there's a lot of driveways and intersections, maybe we need to do something there to improve mobility in terms of reducing some of those intersections. That's a very good one. What else can anyone think of? What about if when we're thinking about how long it takes to get from one point to the other, maybe someone can say something about, okay, if I'm going from the airport to downtown Laredo, I'm going to ask, as a visitor, but I've been there enough times I kind of have an idea. How long does it take me to get from the airport to downtown? No one's driven that. How about pick another spot out on the loop to downtown? It could be the arena or something else.
I think downtown to the airport would be like 15 minutes, maybe.
Okay. And is that something you feel like that's pretty reasonable no matter what time of day? And so if you had a visitor coming in, they say, how long should I expect the drive to take me? Sarah, you're going to say about 15 minutes, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Does that change very much during peak hour compared to middle of the morning or middle of the afternoon, do you think?
Yes, I do, because certain hours there's more traffic, people leaving work earlier or school or something. So yes.
Yeah, you've hit on a couple of things. One, people leaving work, especially in the evening or going to work in the morning. And I've driven that corridor either from hotels out there or the airport going into downtown. And it's interesting to use that Waze app, and it'll tell me, well, if you go this route, it'll take 12 minutes. If you go this route, it's going to take 20 or 22. And typically I'm going to choose the shorter, quicker one. But by the different times of days and different things that are going on, we need to consider like school zones and people going to or being picked up from school and congestion that can occur around those, as well as people going to or from work. So Sarah, you hit on some very good things. And again, those are the types of things that travel time index. And in other words, what I mean when I say that is if it takes me 20% longer during the peak time compared to off peak, then is there something I can do during to the situation, to the roadway that'll help out during the peak periods of time? Hopefully that kind of makes some sense. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say another thing to take into consideration if you're looking at downtown specifically and getting in and out of downtown is also the train schedule.
Yes.
Because if you're not going through I-35 or going the back way to use the Washington Street, the West End Washington Street overpass, essentially downtown gets cut off entirely because the train's passing through, and that happens at certain times throughout the day. I know like the one in the afternoon, I believe it's like a 2 to 3 schedule. And then there's, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, like a 7 o'clock schedule and about a 9:30, 10 o'clock train. So if you look at if traveling at any point of that time, you might be cut off, either stuck in downtown or unable to get to downtown. So those are, not just roadway infrastructure, but other transportation modalities that are at play interact with what we're talking about here.
Very good point, Juan. And I've experienced that as well. And I've seen it, especially when that afternoon train kind of gets stopped and backs up for a while, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so what y'all are doing, and I like this process we're going through, y'all are identifying some of the things that become part of your project selection process in Laredo specifically. Because I can tell you, well, you've got to do this. You should give safety a certain weighting. You should give congestion a certain weighting or value, and so on, and all these other criteria. But what our conversation here is doing is it's possibly affirming the process y'all have been using or gives some ideas for modifying it in the future. But you have a railroad that can affect getting into and out of downtown at least twice a day. And that comes back to that reliability. Can I rely on the system to get me from point A to point B? Does it depend on what time of day it is? What if that train is off schedule and those types of things? And again, it all comes back to, and this might be one of my last questions just to see if we have any other discussion, but does anyone have a feel for, as a result of being involved in public participation and workshops and so on, what are one or two of the major things or issues that are most important to the citizens of Laredo when it comes to transportation? What do y'all think the residents of Laredo would want to have improved or fixed on the transportation system? And don't be afraid if you think, well, this is an obvious answer, go ahead and say it.
They want more lanes. They want more capacity.
Okay. On multiple roads or very specific roads?
Specific roads. We're talking about our system, 30, 35, Loop 20, which we're already taking care of that with the I-69 corridor. And we're talking about the city. I know they've mentioned McPherson is a huge corridor in our city, and other streets like maybe Delmar, parts of Delmar. And if we get back to our corridors, um, sections of US 59 and SH 359, some areas that going outside our city limits. Those are some, obviously also US 83, but the south portion is what we call Zapata Highway. There's a lot of congestion in those areas. Of people who have always wanted more lanes in that particular part of town.
And that's going south. Yeah.
South Laredo, yes, sir.
Okay, gotcha. All right, well, Omar, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those. And that's kind of what I was trying to pull out of one of the answers. So I appreciate you speaking up with those because, again, what you just mentioned is from experience, being with the public, looking at different things, here's what some of their priorities are. And you put it in some really good ways. They want more lanes. They want more capacity. They want to, which kind of translates to they want to get places faster. What happens then is when y'all start to score the projects and look at them, does it make sense to just put more lanes on a certain road? Should we add some new additional parallel routes? Should we make improvements on other routes? Because that way y'all are looking at the comprehensive view and y'all can effectively score projects trying to achieve what the public was wanting to begin with. I hope that kind of made sense the way I summed that up. Go ahead, Kirby. Were you going to say something?
No, sir.
Oh, okay. I couldn't tell, but I think that's good. We could go on a little bit more, but I think people are getting the gist of. And instead of, again, the way I was trying to do it this time with this workshop, instead of telling you, here's how to, the best way necessarily to select your projects. I mean, obviously, like I said, they need to line up with your goals and your vision and help you achieve your targets. But the things that y'all have been talking about, responding to the needs, and then just me adding in, look at some different ways to achieve those desires as opposed to maybe just one specific desire in terms of more lanes that they mentioned. So hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you, Bill. It was great. And does anybody have any comments, questions, or thoughts about public participation in general or project selection in general? Any questions or thoughts you want to add before we close? We've got about 5 minutes here.
And just as a word, we will make these slides available. The presentation will be recorded. Carol, do you mind going ahead and go down to the next slide so they'll show up especially? Here's some materials that Kirk Favre from Federal Highways and I have put together. Here's a few different documents that people can go to get some more information or some summaries of things. And then there's just another slide with some acknowledgments that we've already kind of made available or mentioned. And then just to make sure people have it, Carol, go to the final slide here. And this is contact information for Kirk at Federal Highways and me at TTI. And we both can help get answers, whether we know the answer or not, but we can always help get other answers. And I know this seems like a very final slide, but I wanted to toss this in at the end of my sessions as Kirk will take over for the next two later on, but I'll still be on the call and can help out. But just want to make sure people know there's resources out here.
Bill, on behalf of the Laredo and Webb County area MPO, I want to say thank you for taking time today for this training. This is the first of many trainings in the future we hope to provide. So thank you for taking the time and preparing this presentation. We have a 15-minute break. Well, more like 20 minutes. Our next session starts at 2:15. So we are going to end this one and we'll start the other one up about 5-10 minutes before so everybody can join. So if you signed up for the next session, we'll see you at 2:15. Otherwise, we'll be recording all the sessions today and making those available to everyone. Thank you for those who participated. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.